Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are incredibly glad to have you listening today as we begin a massive, highly detailed deep dive into some truly exceptional source material.
Yeah, it is quite a lot to cover, but it is so worth it.
It really is. Our core mission for today's discussion is to take a magnifying glass to the first chapter of the book of Romans. Specifically, we are looking at verses 1 through 32.
Right.
And we are pulling our insights directly from the commentary, critical, and explanatory on the whole Bible, which was authored by David Brown and his colleagues. I want to set up the stakes for you right from the very beginning. Whether you are actively preparing for a theological discussion, or maybe brushing up on your historical context of the early church, or you are simply eager to understand the scriptural text without feeling overwhelmed by an avalanche of academic jargon, this specific deep dive is crafted to give you clear, actionable knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are taking this dense commentary and breaking it wide open so you can see the absolute brilliance of the arguments being made.
And to truly grasp the historical and theological weight of Romans chapter 1, we have to look at the landscape Paul was stepping into when he wrote this letter.
Set the scene for us.
Well, this text establishes the absolute necessity of justification by faith. And it does so by first proving the universal guilt of mankind. The commentary we are referencing provides a meticulous, verse-by-verse breakdown of this reality. Our discussion today will strictly adhere to this provided commentary, applying a reformed theological lens to comprehend human depravity and divine grace.
Right, because we are looking at a text that systematically dismantles human pride. It sets the necessary stage for grace. It is a brilliant piece of logic that begins with the author's own submission.
Yeah, submission is the perfect word for it.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at how Paul opens his letter in verses 1 through 7. He begins with his self-identification, which is incredibly telling right out of the gate. Paul calls himself a bondservant.
Which is a loaded term.
Highly loaded. The commentary specifically notes that this word means one who is subject to the will and completely at the disposal of another. Paul is making a massive statement about ownership. He is not a volunteer. He is property.
I mean, that sets the tone immediately.
It does. Furthermore, the text points out the specific timeline of his calling. He was called to faith and apostleship simultaneously, separated unto the gospel of God. There was no gap between his conversion and his commission.
Right. The moment he believed, he was entirely set apart for this specific work.
Let's talk about that term, servant of the Lord.
Yeah, the historical context regarding that term adds massive weight to his opening greeting. In the Old Testament, this was not just a description of humility. It was an official title reserved for prophets and kings.
Like Moses.
Like Moses or David. The theological implication here is quite striking. By calling himself a servant of Christ in this very official sense, Paul yields absolute subjection to Jesus. He is proving that he views Jesus as divine, not a created being.
Because you do not place yourself at the absolute disposal of a mere mortal. Not in the way the Old Testament figures yielded to Yahweh.
Precisely. Paul is aligning his subjection to Jesus with the ancient prophetic subjection to God himself. This would have been a staggering claim for a trained Pharisee to make.
That distinction brings up the fascinating way the text handles Christ's dual nature in verses 3 and 4. The specific wording is critical to get right.
It is very specific.
Jesus was made of the seed of David according to the flesh, but he was declared or proved to be the Son of God.
Yes.
The commentary draws a sharp line between being made flesh and being declared the Son. It is a very deliberate choice of verbs that Paul is using to communicate something highly specific about the incarnation.
What's fascinating here is the nuance of the Greek text highlighted by the scholars. Christ was not made the Son of God. His sonship is eternal and uncreated.
It always existed.
Right. The commentary states that the incarnation was simply this eternal sonship blooming or efflorescing into palpable reality. Think of it like a seed that is already fully alive under the soil.
Okay, I like that analogy.
When it breaks the surface and blooms, it did not suddenly become a plant, it just became visible to us. That is how Paul wants us to view the incarnation. Jesus did not become God's son at birth. He simply became visible to humanity.
And the commentary also analyzes the phrase spirit of holiness, right?
It does. Paul used this rare phrase instead of Holy Ghost specifically to describe Christ's immaterial divine nature in contrast to human flesh. He did this to avoid confusion regarding the Trinity.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, if he had used Holy Spirit, readers might have misunderstood the mechanics of the incarnation, confusing the second and third persons of the Godhead.
Moving into verses 5 through 7, The text summarizes that grace and apostleship were given for the obedience of faith among all nations. This explicitly includes the Roman believers, whom Paul describes as being beloved of God.
A beautiful sentiment.
It is, but it also asks you to consider the startling juxtaposition in verse 7. Grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, if you just casually reading, you might skip right past that.
Most people do.
But placing those two names together in that way is a massive theological statement.
The commentary cites the scholar Olshausen on this precise point. This juxtaposition is undeniable proof of Christ's divinity. The name of no mortal man can be placed side by side with the Almighty in dispensing divine grace and peace.
It would be absurd.
It suggests that grace and peace flow equally from God the Father and a created being would be sheer blasphemy in the Jewish mindset. Therefore, Paul is establishing beyond any doubt the full deity of Christ right in his opening salutation. He is setting the theological parameters for the entire letter before he even gets to his main argument.
Which is brilliant framing. Shifting the topic to Paul's pastoral heart in verses 8 through 15, we see his unceasing prayers for the Roman Church. He notes how their faith is famous worldwide.
Yes.
He also details his delayed travels. He mentions he wanted to visit Rome for a long time but was hindered. It is wild to think about the timeline here. He eventually arrived nearly a quarter of a century after his conversion.
25 years.
And only then as a prisoner in chains. This was not the triumphant apostolic entry he probably envisioned when he first started praying about going to Rome.
Paul's reliance on the will of God for his schedule is a key point of analysis here. The delay taught him that his entire future rested in divine hands. He could not force his way to Rome no matter how strategic it seemed.
He had to wait.
And additionally, the specific nature of Rome as a global capital made it highly practical for news of their faith to spread across the provinces. Rome was the New York, London, and Tokyo of the ancient world rolled into one.
The center of the universe.
Pretty much. The constant influx and outflow of travelers, merchants, and officials meant that a thriving Christian community in the heart of the empire would be talked about everywhere. If a movement gained traction in Rome, the entire civilized world knew about it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When we look at Paul's stated reason for visiting in verses 11 and 12, Paul initially says he wants to impart a spiritual gift to establish them, but he immediately catches his own wording.
He pivots.
He corrects himself to say he wants mutual comfort through their shared faith. He softens his statement to ensure they know he expects to receive as well as give. He does not want to come across as the arrogant expert swooping in to fix them.
This is a remarkable demonstration of radical humility. The text quotes John Calvin's insight on this verse. There is no one so poor in the church who cannot impart something valuable to others. Only pride hinders us from gathering fruit from every believer.
That is a great quote.
It is. The commentary draws a stark contrast between this apostolic style of mutual edification and the top-down hierarchy of the papal court of Rome. Now, we should be clear here for you listening. Brown's commentary was written from a specific historical Protestant viewpoint, and the authors make a sharp contrast here to illustrate their view of genuine church structure.
Right, and we are just impartially reporting on the content provided in the source material today. We are not endorsing any specific political or denominational attacks, simply aiming to convey the ideas contained in the original commentary.
Precisely. They argue that Paul, despite his massive apostolic authority, views himself as a fellow believer in need of the comfort that comes from the faith of the Roman Christians. They view this as standing in stark contrast to a rigid, top-down hierarchy.
This perfectly leads into Paul's sense of obligation in verse 14. He declares he is a debtor to both the cultured Greeks and the uncultured barbarians. His message is ordained equally for all classes of mankind.
No one is excluded.
He does not view himself as superior to the uneducated, nor is he intimidated by the philosophical elites. He looks at every single person, regardless of their social standing or education level, and says, I owe you something.
That sense of debt is driven by the universal necessity of the gospel. Paul possesses the only cure for a terminal disease affecting all of humanity, making him a debtor to everyone who needs it. He feels a moral obligation to deliver the message.
It is a heavy burden.
And this bridges directly into the core thesis of the letter found in verses 16 and 17, where he explains what this message is and why it is so desperately needed by everyone in Rome.
Yes, transitioning into the most famous verses of the chapter, Paul says he is not ashamed of the gospel, even in the mistress of the world, which is Rome. Think about how crazy this sounds.
It sounds like a death wish, honestly.
He is bringing the message of a crucified Jewish carpenter to the apex of human civilization, where such a message might be seen as utter foolishness. Crucifixion was a shameful, humiliating execution for criminals, yet Paul is bringing it to the cultural elites. Let us closely paraphrase verse 16. The gospel carries divine might for salvation to everyone who believes, Jew and Gentile alike.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these verses are the thesis statement of the entire book of Romans. Salvation is the overwhelming necessity of perishing men. The commentary breaks down verse 17 meticulously. The righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. The word used for might in the Greek is dunamis, which implies an active, working energy.
Like dynamite.
Very similar root, yes. This gospel is not a passive philosophy, it is an active rescue operation.
Could you clarify what from faith to faith actually means? That specific phrasing can confuse modern readers who might think it refers to jumping from one level of belief to another, like leveling up in a video game. It sounds like progressive stages.
According to the sources, it definitely does not mean progressive stages of belief. Instead, it means the righteousness of God is revealed in order to be received by faith. The commentary references the quotation of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, "The just shall live by faith."
That makes more sense.
It stresses the Reformed theological view presented in the text. Faith itself is God's gift. This arrangement prevents self-righteousness, making salvation entirely an act of grace. God provides the necessary righteousness, and God provides the faith required to receive that righteousness.
It takes human boasting completely out of the equation.
Entirely. Humanity brings absolutely nothing to the table except the sin that makes salvation necessary.
So what does this all mean? We have to pivot to the darkest part of the text to understand why this given righteousness is so desperately necessary. It is necessary because of the wrath of God.
The backdrop to all of this.
Verse 18 details that God's holy displeasure is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. This is not a human temper tantrum. It is a settled, holy opposition to evil.
The terms must be defined clearly based on the text to understand the scope of this wrath. Ungodliness is irreligiousness. It is living without conscious reference to God.
Just completely ignoring the Creator.
Exactly. Unrighteousness refers to moral deviations in heart, speech, and behavior. It is how we treat each other. Because everyone is guilty of these to some extent, every human being falls under this universal condemnation.
Which is heavy.
It is. But this bad news is the necessary backdrop for the good news of salvation. Without the reality of the wrath of God, the gospel ceases to be good news. It just becomes friendly advice.
The text discusses the concept of men holding down or stifling the truth. It asks how a person deadens the still small voice of conscience. People suppress what they inherently know.
It is an act of resistance.
It is like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It takes constant active effort to suppress the truth of God that is pressing up against human consciousness.
This brings us to verses 19 and 20 regarding general revelation. The commentary explains that God's invisible attributes, his eternal might and Godhead, are clearly seen through the creation of the world.
You just have to look around.
Yeah, there is a synergy between inner and outer revelation. Faith has primary sources within the human breast, but outward creation acts as the interpreter. Therefore, humanity is without excuse.
Without excuse. That is a terrifying phrase.
The internal conscience and the external universe both testify to the existence and nature of God. It leaves absolutely no room for a plea of ignorance on Judgment Day.
The text traces a tragic downward progression starting in verse 21. People knew God, but failed to glorify him or give thanks. The result is described vividly. They became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish inner man was darkened.
A total collapse of the intellect.
It is a terrifying sequence. First, you stop being thankful. Then your thinking gets cloudy. Finally, the lights go out entirely in your soul.
This raises an important question regarding the history of human religion. The text addresses the sociological theory that human religion evolved upward from primitive animism to complex monotheism.
That is the standard secular narrative today.
It strongly contrasts this theory with the commentary's assertion that paganism is actually a devolution, a fall from primeval innocence and a willful violence to the dictates of conscience. Mankind did not start in the mud and reach for the stars. Mankind started with the knowledge of God and actively suppressed it, dragging their worship down into the mud.
You can see this devolution illustrated using the specific examples from the text. The commentary mentions the exchange of God's glory for images of corruptible man, referencing the exquisite Greek statues on Mars Hill. The Greeks thought they were elevating humanity with these beautiful sculptures, but Paul says they were degrading the divine.
And it goes even further down.
It does, into the lower degradation of worshiping birds, beasts, and creeping things, referencing Egyptian and Oriental worship.
The irony in verse 22 is palpable. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. The commentary highlights the insight that pride in human wisdom makes true spiritual understanding impossible.
The smarter they thought they were, the blinder they got.
When humanity decides it knows better than the Creator, the inevitable result is intellectual and spiritual foolishness. It culminates in bowing down to statues of animals. The intellect is entirely compromised by the rebellion of the will.
This leads to the chilling phrase repeated 3 times in the text. God gave them up, or gave them over. Could you explain this concept of righteous retribution? It sounds less like a lightning bolt from the sky and more like taking his hands off the steering wheel.
This is the concept of judicial abandonment. The text quotes the scholar Grotius. As men deserted God, God deserted them. He didn't send prophets, he simply let them do what they pleased.
That is almost scarier than a direct punishment.
It is the ultimate punishment. The commentary also includes a critique of idolatry here, noting how material images in worship inevitably lower religious conceptions and taint society. The authors, again, writing from their Protestant framework, specifically reference the Church of Rome in this regard.
Right.
They contrast the use of material images with the high standard of social virtue expected in genuine Protestantism. And again, as we said, whether one agrees with that specific historical critique or not, we are just conveying the source material. The broader theological point is clear. When God hands a society over to its own desires, it is the most terrifying judgment imaginable.
The moral collapse described in verses 26 and 27 is severe. The text explains how vice consumes and exhausts itself. It shares memorable historical details. When natural passions became impotent, society sought artificial stimulants.
The decay just accelerates.
It mentions references to Sodom, the lesbians who refined Greece, and the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who famously retreated to the island of Capri and had to coin new words for newly invented vices because the old sins were no longer thrilling enough.
The commentary discusses the recompense of their error, how vice is self-avenging physically and morally under God's righteous government. Sin carries its own punishment built into its very nature.
It destroys the vessel it occupies.
And the final, lowest stage of depravity is found in verse 32. Knowing the judgment of God, people not only commit these acts, but have pleasure in those who do them. Unblushing satisfaction in cheering on the sins of others is the darkest feature of human rebellion.
It's one thing to fall into sin out of weakness, but entirely another to applaud it.
It shows a complete alignment with evil, moving beyond personal weakness into active advocacy for rebellion against the Creator.
To summarize the sweeping narrative covered in this deep dive, we moved from Paul's absolute subjection to Christ to the glorious provision of justification by faith. We then moved all the way to the grim reality of a humanity universally condemned by its own suppression of the truth. Understanding this stark backdrop of human rebellion makes the free gift of grace infinitely more beautiful. You cannot fully appreciate the rescue until you understand the sheer magnitude of the peril.
As a final thought, we must recognize the necessity of critical thinking when facing a world of information. The text echoes the assertion that truth is often actively suppressed by human pride. We must constantly evaluate our own assumptions and ensure we are not holding down the truth in unrighteousness.
If the outward creation leaves humanity entirely without excuse regarding the existence of God, how does the way you interact with the natural world reflect your own recognition of His eternal nature today? Thank you for listening to Reformed Thinking, and we leave you to ponder the depths of the source material.